Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister says tempers need to calm down in Parliament after the torrid scenes in the Commons last night. Boris Johnson says he totally deplores any threats to anybody, particularly female MPs, but has refused to apologise for his use of language. Several MPs said they had been on the receiving end of death threats, partially blaming Mr Johnson's speeches on Brexit for fuelling extremist behaviour. The Speaker, John Bercow, described the culture as toxic and said it was the worst atmosphere he had ever witnessed in the House. This report from our political editor Laura Kuenssberg contains some very strong language.
We will not betray the people who sent us here.
Subject to death threats and abuse every single day.
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
This is the language. A publicist, this is it.
Politics has never been for faint hearts.
This man is an idiot. We won't tolerate this. Sorry.
But there was poison in the air last night.
Right. That is respectable, whatever your views are.
Was your language in the Commons yesterday appropriate?
Frustrated by a lack of Brexit progress, the Prime Minister is happy to provoke.
I totally deplore any threats to anybody, particularly female MPs. And a lot of work is being done to stop that and to give people the security that they need. Okay. But I do think it's important that in the House of Commons I should be able to talk about the Surrender Bill and the Surrender Act in the way that I did.
But there's fury from Labour MPs at that kind of talk. An encounter between a Labour MP and the Prime Minister's advisor, Dominic Cummings, in Parliament was filmed by a member of the MP's team.
I've had death threats overnight. Should be dead. It's a disgrace.
The MP, Carl Turner, said he'd had death threats last night. Mr Cummings' answer: get Brexit done.
Don't tell me to get Brexit done.
In the Commons itself, a sense of disbelief for a moment the morning after the night before.
Yesterday, the House did itself no credit.
Still rage, though, from a friend of the murdered MP, Joe Cox.
When I hear of my friend's murder and the way that it has made me and my colleagues feel, and feel scared, described as humbug, I actually don't feel anger towards the Prime Minister. I feel pity for those of you who still have to toe his line.
One MP, though, told me everyone's a hypocrite. Every side is guilty.
It was yesterday she was the person I could hear screaming the loudest from her bench.
But most of the ire was reserved for the Prime Minister.
To dismiss concerns from members about the death threats they receive and to dismiss concerns that the language used by the Prime Minister is being repeated in those death threats is reprehensible.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is not fit for office. His behaviour is an outrage and his government is treating people disgracefully.
Yet the Prime Minister's backers believe Brexit's opponents will do almost anything to attack him.
There is a strategy. The Prime Minister is the last thing standing between ending the Brexit enterprise entirely. He can expect no quarter. Absolutely everything is going to be thrown at him.
As he prepared to gather his cabinet, the Prime Minister said tempers need to come down.
But whatever the difficulty, whatever the distress, there is no intention in Downing Street, none at all, of pulling back from their overall tough approach. A belief even this is a pent-up conflict that must play out to clear the way for Brexit.
You losers, you bad losers!
Frustrations built up in every corner of this strange political village. Playing tough might appeal to some, but other voters might take fright. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, many veteran MPs and political commentators say they've not witnessed such angry scenes in all their years at Parliament. But what's been the reaction outside Westminster? Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been to the Conservative constituency of Walsall North, which voted to leave the EU, to find out.
Life on this factory floor feels a far cry from the chaos in Westminster. This family firm in Walsall designs and makes high-end door and window fittings. And plenty here think Parliament needs to get a grip.
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
Peter's from Slovakia and has lived in the UK for 8 years. He thinks the language being used is stoking division.
They shouldn't be really, using that kind of language in there, like betrayal and stuff, because it's, probably fueling the atmosphere that is in a society.
For people trying to get on with work and life, frustration at politicians is rife. Director Paul is craving an end to Brexit uncertainty, and the scenes in Parliament don't fill him with confidence.
When people are trying to make decisions in a highly emotive state like last night, it's unlikely to reach any agreement. I mean, as a business, we just couldn't act in that way. We need to keep planning, we need to keep moving forward, and this kind of almost childish behaviour is not what you want to see.
This is a Conservative constituency, but only by a narrow margin. Most people here voted Leave. Is the kind of place Number 10 hopes its firm Brexit message will play well.
From the start, Boris Johnson has tried to paint himself as the man who will stick up for the Brexit-backing public, the person who'll deliver for those who voted Leave. And the language he's using is all part of that strategy, trying to put himself on the side of the people versus what he portrays as a parliament trying to hinder Brexit.
Critics say it's a divisive tactic, but for some in the coffee and grill, it's working.
He's right in a good many things what he says. It's what people out here like us say.
Colin too is convinced.
What other language could he use? He's been stitched up by Parliament as far as I'm concerned. They're hypocrites. The country voted out. Whether you like it or not, the country voted Brexit.
But his son doesn't trust Boris Johnson or anyone.
I feel, oh my God, I've already fucking Conservatives, so what am I going to do now? Because I hate them all.
We're all going to starve to death. We'll have no medicines. It's such a garbage.
For many, the heated arguments are simply a turn-off.
Can get out of hand, I think. Yeah.
But they never seem to agree with each other, do they? It's just like one long battle all the time.
At the local pet shop, there's a much stronger view.
The public are thinking, this is what we voted for, this is our government, and it's just disgraceful.
So while Westminster continues to wrangle, the country continues to watch, still divided and increasingly frustrated. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Well, our political editor Laura Koonsberg is in Downing Street for us now, so everybody wondering now what happens next.
Yes, Sophie, the Cabinet has just finishing up a meeting. They've been gathering here in Downing Street for the last couple of hours. And I think in terms of what's happened in the last 24 hours, clearly there has been real alarm in some quarters of the country and some quarters of people here in Westminster. But on the other side, as we were hearing there from Alex's report, for a lot of people what's happened in the last 24 hours is a symbol of the fact that this Parliament has failed by failing to come up with any agreement with each other on moving Brexit forward, and also still is more interested in arguing amongst itself rather than actually getting anything done. Now, it's that frustration that we know that Boris Johnson believes and hopes he can play into, and we know he's spent his career trying to provoke and enjoying flouting convention. But it is also, and some people in his own government believe this, no question, a difficult and maybe a dangerous strategy too. The Conservative conference will go ahead next week, and we're in a vital run-up to the EU summit next month, when he hopes, maybe hoping against hope, he may be able to achieve a Brexit deal. But if not, there will be plenty more strife ahead, and politicians getting angrier and angrier and angrier with each other does not help anybody end this saga.
Laura, thank you.
Well, here in Westminster, shocked MPs have spent today conducting a post-mortem into how last night's Commons debate descended into such rancour and anger. Many MPs, including some Conservatives, have blamed Boris Johnson for using divisive language. There was fury when he said the concerns of female MPs about their safety was humbug. This evening, the Prime Minister has said he deplores threats to MPs, but he insisted that he should be able to describe the law which will force him to ask for an extension to Brexit if he can't get a deal as the Surrender Act. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is here. Well, here we are talking about the Surrender Act. Is that what he wants?
I think it is. There's just been a political cabinet this afternoon at which
I think there was an attempt to make sure ministers held their nerve as bits of the strategy looked like they were falling off, and they had a presentation on polling and the election, and they were told that this phrase, Surrender Act, is really cutting through to voters and works with a great chunk of voters when they hear it. And they're saying that that's the reason why the opposition are trying to gag them. The opposition, of course, say that's not why they're trying to drop phrases like that. It's because the warlike language blurs with other, more extreme warlike language, and that helps to support even more anger out there and violence. But the Tories have a problem with people in their own backyard on this. One cabinet minister told me he felt sick to his stomach last night when he was listening to the Prime Minister's rhetoric. And one Tory MP who's a lawyer told me he was worried for his professional reputation being connected with the party right now. The other development that has been running on today is this question about whether the government will implement the law which Parliament passed, which makes sure that, or tries to make sure that Boris Johnson has no option. If he hasn't got a deal, he's got to have a Brexit extension. Senior government sources I've been speaking to say they really are pretty confident that they've found a loophole in that bill. And the fact that it just requires the Prime Minister to do a certain thing on a certain day, write that letter on a certain day, doesn't preclude doing things on other days, which might negate it. And into this whole discussion tonight, Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister, has waded in. He's about to give a speech talking about how he thinks there is all sorts of chicanery afoot over trying to avoid what that Act of Parliament was trying to get Boris Johnson to do. And for good measure, he's said that he thinks the current strategy is reckless and divisive. And that's all without what's been going on in there on the second day of the Parliament that was recalled by the Supreme Court, where today they were pretty much focused on yesterday in Parliament.
It's a disgrace!
He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
An MP concerned about death threats mocked by the Prime Minister. All part of an evening in the Commons last night when things seemed to turn darker. The anger was frothing and the provocation for some intolerable.
The best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox would be, I think, to get Brexit done.
The Prime Minister was back this morning for meetings, including one with Tory MPs. He told them he'd carry on talking about opponents surrendering and capitulating. The MP who said that stoked death threats got support from many others.
A cabinet minister came up to me this morning and said he was absolutely horrified, and he said, "I will sort it for you, Paula." He said the Prime Minister doesn't realise what time you've had with threats and abuse. I said, well, you know, the Prime Minister was talking to the nation yesterday and his response was horrific.
Yesterday, the House did itself no credit. There was an atmosphere in the chamber worse than any I've known in my 22 years in the House.
MPs held a special session on the language used in political debate.
It is completely and utterly a part of a strategy designed by somebody to harm and cause hatred in our country. When I hear of my friend's murder and the way that it has made me and my colleagues feel scared, described as humbug, I actually don't feel anger towards the Prime Minister. I feel pity for those of you who still have to toe his line.
I'm afraid it was yesterday she was the person I could hear screaming the loudest from her bench.
At best, the Prime Minister's answers to some of the questions last night were deeply insensitive. But the concern that many of us have is that there is a deliberate strategy of division and confrontation.
He's not the only MP thinking they might be being set up for a brittle general election campaign.
They are specifically ramping up an election campaign. They have designed it, they've tested it, they will have polled it, that is specifically to create division and fear.
And we will be, you know, in people versus Parliament,
We will be the poster boys and girls of Parliament, of this awful place that's trying to frustrate the people's will.
I've only been there 4 years. Boris Johnson's been in and out like a yo-yo over the decades.
I totally deplore any threats to anybody, particularly female MPs. And a lot of work is being done to stop that and to give people the security that they need. Okay. But I do think it's important that in the House of Commons I should be able to talk about the Surrender Bill and the Surrender Act in the way that I did.
But some MPs feel militaristic language feeds the abuse and menace, peppering placards and shouts on the street from both sides of the Brexit debate. And there's concern that a Tory strategy to set voters against the political class and its institutions could end badly.
If you're going to be ruthless, if you're going to cut corners, you have to actually win and not create more opposition to yourself.
And you worry that's exactly what might be happening now?
It might be happening now.
Well, it seems to me that Parliament and the courts and the civil service have all been collateral in the headlong rush to a no-deal Brexit which nobody voted for. It seems a very odd strategy.
If Boris Johnson thinks he can rebuild those things sometime soon, tack back towards the middle ground.
Well, we'll all be left picking out the pieces, but there's only so much damage you can do before it becomes terminal. It's a bit like political climate change.
In Brussels, the EU Brexit negotiator didn't comment on yesterday in Parliament.
Surprise!
But said he was still waiting for revised Brexit proposals from Britain.
We are still ready to work on any new legal and operational proposal in the UK.
And Boris Johnson says real progress is being made. Is he telling the truth? Is he exaggerating?
We are still waiting to work.
We are still waiting to work, Michel Barnier said. This afternoon, Labour MP Jess Phillips' constituency office in Birmingham was attacked by a man reported to have been shouting fascist. Police said they'd arrested a man on suspicion of a public order offence.
Well, earlier I spoke to the former Conservative leader and prominent Brexiteer Ian Duncan Smith. I asked him how appropriate it was for the Prime Minister to say that the best way to honour Jo Cox's memory was to complete Brexit.
I think there's been a lot of nonsense talked about it. It was robust, it was angry, but I've been here 27 years and I've seen worse, angrier debates. Insults were, yes, I have. Insults were flying across the floor from Labour, calling people cheats, liars, you know, they're fascists. I mean, I have to tell you, it's a bit of the pot calling the kettle black. I think it was wrong to introduce Jo Cox's name into the debate, whichever side you sat, because it was, as her husband has said, it was the wrong thing to do.
When Jo Cox's family are upset, when her friends are upset, when even the Prime Minister's own sister has berated him, really, is it right that he's refusing to apologise? Would you like to see him apologise?
No, I don't think so at all. I agree that it was wrong to bring Jo Cox into that debate. It had no bearing on the debate at all, and I think those who were trying to bring her in were trying to use her in a sense, and that was wrong. We shouldn't Labour was trying to we shouldn't either side. You know, there are many Conservative MPs who have died, been killed by terrorists in the course of their time in Parliament. I can think of Erin Neve and many others. I would no more dream of bringing them into a debate like that to make a point. The truth is, there was very fundamental disagreement across the floor last night. But, you know, get out of Parliament and go out on the streets and you will find now there is a growing sense of anger.
And a lot of MPs say that when they go about their business, they feel that anger. And that was the point Paula Sheriff, the Labour MP, was trying to make when she said that people quoted back at her the words of the Prime Minister, surrender, betrayal, and she feels scared. And he dismissed that by saying it's all humbug.
No, the words surrender and betrayal are not threatening words. They are words that describe, as adjectives, what many of the British people feel about the nature of what has been going on here. Now, it's very important.
Seeing everything as a battle,
I
isn't
have
it?
had a ton of stuff. Accusatory from a hard left endlessly. I've had death threats. I've had all of that stuff at me. I've been accused of being a murderer. All these things from people who have no idea how to debate. It is not alone that on one side of the House they have had attacks. This goes on forever. It went on long before Brexit, I have to tell you. So let's get this into context. It's absolutely wrong for anybody to use that kind of language, attack individual MPs, make them feel scared. Of course it is, as it is for any other member of the public.
I just want to read you just some tweets from the daughter of a Labour MP, Yvette Cooper. Ellie Cooper. She says, I'm scared. I'm scared when I scroll through the replies to her tweets, her mum's tweets, calling her a liar and a traitor. I'm scared when our house gets fitted with panic buttons, industrial locking doors and explosive bags to catch the mail. Of course Brexit is contentious. Of course people have strong opinions. But what we need now is a Prime Minister who can stand up and say, yes, I want to deliver Brexit, but regardless of my position, this inflammatory and aggressive language needs to stop. Boris Johnson, it's your job to unite the country. How do you react to that?
Well, I'm sure she feels sincerely those sentiments, and I'm sorry that she feels that. All I simply come back to my simple statement is, I did not hear last night anything that was said in the course of the debate from Boris Johnson that was set out to be inflammatory. He made some clear...
Humbug, that's...
No, well, is that an inflammatory language?
Well, when the Labour MP had set out her fears and he said it was a load of humbug.
No, he was talking about the raising of this as though it was him that had created this atmosphere. He has not created that atmosphere.
Would you feel differently if your daughter had put out a series of tweets like that?
Listen, I'm not going to get involved in this personal stuff. I have children, all right? So the idea that somehow I'm hard-hearted to this, I'm not. But the honest truth is I have faced a lot of threats in my time, and I'm not prepared to have this thrown back as though it suddenly only happens to a Labour MP because now they're feeling frightened. They're angry out there, not because Boris Johnson has taken up post, but because Parliament itself made a promise. They voted for it massively. We will deliver. And now they have blocked every single opportunity to get out. That is where the problem arises. I'm a great believer. Deal with the cause, not the symptom.
Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, opposition MPs have claimed Boris Johnson is sticking to his inflammatory rhetoric because focus groups have shown it's popular with the voters he needs to win an election. So I asked the leader of the Lib Dems, Jo Swinson, if she had focus grouped her party's bollocks to Brexit slogan and found it equally effective.
To be fair, I remember getting asked about it, and I did think that it would get the message across. I also think that it's a word within our language which, yeah, is slightly on the naughty side, but doesn't carry with it the same kind of malice, and I think most people can totally tell the difference. I mean, the word humbug is not the problem, it's the context in which it was used. Entirely inappropriate response to the genuine fear that Paula Sheriff had outlined.
Jo Swinson talking to us down at Westminster.
A dead Parliament, the surrender bill, MPs described as traitors. All these words were tossed about here by Boris Johnson and his team yesterday. But were they just banter or designed to chime with Brexit-backing voters? Parag O'Brien reports.
This Prime Minister to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
Welcome to the politics of outrage.
Surrender Act, betrayal, traitor, and I, for one, am sick of it.
To the language of war.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman, I think, will agree that the Surrender Act
to the Mother of Parliaments that last night went all linguistic Lord of the Flies.
But they're too cowardly!
Craig Dillon runs Digital Westminster.
John McDonnell famously called Esther McVeigh, said that he wanted to lynch the Can I say that?
Works with MPs to produce viral social media campaigns.
Jess Phillips said that she will knife Corbyn in the front.
He also monitors the kind of language MPs from all parties use online. Let's start with the word surrender.
So the use of surrender has really shot up since, say, August. It was only tweeted 8 times. In September, it's been tweeted 128 times of surrender.
Okay. Next up, MPs' use of the word traitor in tweets.
Yeah, and it dropped down in August. So obviously people thought there wasn't much treachery in August, but apparently September it's rocketed.
Finally, the word coup.
You can see same again, you know, quite low on here, and then straight up in August, which is obviously when they prorogued. The language is becoming more aggressive and dramatic, and you know.
Why do you think?
It's about social media. It's all about, you know, the clickbaity sort of getting the attention.
So does this language just articulate our new incendiary politics, or is something else afoot? Today in Parliament, one MP felt it was the latter.
It has clearly been tested and workshopped and worked up, and it is entirely designed to inflame hatred and division.
The problem with appeals to dial down the language is that someone has to be the one that actually starts doing that. And in today's culture of hashtags and memes and viral content, who will be the politician who decides to rein in emotive headline-grabbing language? Who will be the politician who bravely decides to become more boring?
Well, earlier I spoke to the Labour MP Ali McGovern and Conservative Maria Miller, who's chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee. I began by asking Alison McGovern how she reacted to the Prime Minister's claim about her murdered friend, the MP Jo Cox.
Well, I think that was a mistake on his part. I think he should never have said that. But actually, that came at quite near to the end of some very difficult exchanges. And look, to be honest, what happened yesterday was not good at all. My concern is that it's not about the Prime Minister's language in one debate in the House of Commons, one set of questions. It's about the Prime Minister's language over the past months, actually. It's about his language being violent in nature, and it's about his lack of sensitivity to what many have been through, including Jo's friends and family. And really what I was hoping for yesterday was that once he saw the strength of feeling, he would immediately realise that he had touched a very raw nerve, and that he might perhaps maybe ask to see a few of us and try to understand why it was we felt so strongly about the language that he'd chosen to use. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened even today.
I mean, how did you feel when you were in there, you know, knowing Jo as you did?
Devastated, devastated. I don't want my grief or anyone else's grief to be played out in public in that way. I don't want that. I want to be able to do my job in the House of Commons, and I want us to be able to discuss Brexit like adults without it descending to a debate that is just people shouting at each other.
Maria Miller, you can see how upset Alison McGovern is and how upset she was last night. Do you feel the Prime Minister, it would be a relatively small, easy thing actually to apologise for the language he used last night?
In the debate yesterday, the Prime Minister was responding to an intervention from a Labour Member of Parliament, and I think he did that respectfully in what was a very, very heated environment. And I think there was a great deal of yesterday's debate that members on both sides need to reflect on. But the one thing that I didn't get out of that was a disrespect in any way, shape or form for a colleague who really gave the ultimate and lost her life as a result of the work that she was doing in her constituency. Now, I realise there are
I think Alison wants to respond to that point.
But there are high feelings on this, and it's absolutely right. But the Prime Minister couldn't simply disregard a question that he'd been asked.
He did not have to use the words that he used, and at the point where he could see people were distressed in the chamber, he could have stepped back from the brink, from the kind of terminology that he used.
And I think it's right that we all reflect on the way things happened yesterday. But I would say that people listening to this could be forgiven for thinking that the death of Jo Cox was raised by the Prime Minister. It was not raised by him. It was raised by another Member of Parliament. Yeah. And I would just say, perhaps that shouldn't be something that we talk about in what was an incredibly heated debate. And I would just like to add...
To respond to that point, because it was a Labour MP who brought up Jo Cox's death.
And
Paula Sheriff did as well.
And the reason why that was necessary is not because of what the Prime Minister said yesterday, but because a pattern of use of his language that has been deeply upsetting. And I say again, this is not the way to discuss personal grief. And that ought to be done in a calm and measured way outside the public eye. And that was the point that was made with the Prime Minister yesterday. And if, I'm sure Maria, being the decent person that she is, I'm sure she would want to facilitate that better understanding of where people are at in this. And I'm very hopeful that we as colleagues can all move on from this and try and make it better.
But I think that in raising Jo's memory in the debate yesterday, personally I think that was not necessarily the right format to do that.
Do you regret doing that?
I want us to be able to talk about Brexit without it descending into the way it did yesterday. But I think that those members of Parliament, including Paula Sheriff and others, who express themselves in the way that they did were trying to communicate how difficult this situation is, and I think the Prime Minister should listen first and speak after.
I completely agree with Ali that we need to think very carefully about the debate yesterday, but I also remember very vividly the fear I had when I saw Barry Shearman's intervention as to whether other people could think the way he spoke would be the way to speak about Brexit. It was really quite a frightening intervention.
Barry Shearman is a Labour MP. You know, that Jess Phillips was accused of shouting at the Prime Minister in the lobby. It's something she denies.
No, sorry, but Jess has had a conversation with the Prime Minister in the lobby, and she's reported
by a Labour MP.
And she's reported that. I think the issue that we've got here is that whilst we all point fingers at each other, we won't resolve this. I would be perfectly happy to say that there is conduct in all parties, my party, the Labour Party included, that needs to change. That is why, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, Cathy, because it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere here, that the way to resolve this is for the Prime Minister to listen, understand why we've got into this situation, and then speak, and for all of us to mind our language.
Maria Miller, Ali McGovern, thank you very much.
Well, in the last few minutes, the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, has launched an attack on the current occupant of Number 10 for failing to try to get a deal with the EU. Sir John is still giving his speech at the Spanish Embassy in London.
The Prime Minister tells us that he wishes to have a deal with Europe. But we don't see him sitting down in Brussels hammering out an agreement. Instead, we see him wrestling with bulls in Scotland, inspecting eggs in Wales, arguing with the public in high streets for all the world, as though an election campaign was already in full swing.
Sir John Major with some forthright words on Boris Johnson there.
To politics, and last night and again this morning in the House of Commons, MPs were warning that the language used by the Prime Minister in dealing with his critics on Brexit could have consequences. One of them, Labour's Jess Phillips, called on Mr Johnson this lunchtime to come and apologise. This afternoon came news that her constituency office had been attacked, reportedly by a man shouting that she was a fascist. She said later that she didn't blame the Prime Minister, but everyone had to dial down their language.
The day after debate in Parliament hit new depths of anger and bitterness. The accusation that any lasting damage has been deliberate.
The use of language yesterday and over the past few weeks, such as the surrender bill, such as invoking the war, such as talking about betrayal and treachery, it has clearly been tested and workshopped and worked up, and it is entirely designed to inflame hatred and division.
Across the Commons, MPs raised concerns that their language can feed hostility towards politicians.
How should he suggest I would respond to those in the beautiful marketplace of Romsey who 3 Saturdays ago told me I was a traitor who deserved to be shot, when the language of traitor is heard in this House?
This afternoon, police made an arrest after staff at the constituency office of Jess Phillips MP were allegedly abused by a man who banged the door and windows, shouting fascist. Inside Parliament, the Prime Minister's senior advisor Dominic Cummings faced a furious Labour MP who'd received death threats last night.
That tone of language the Prime Minister is using is going down well in constituencies like mine. I've had death threats overnight. Should be dead. It's a disgrace. Get Brexit. I've had 3 opportunities to get Brexit from Theresa May's and if I could have voted for it, I would have voted for it.
And tonight, Dominic Cummings, a man who usually prefers to stay in the shadows, was still being put in the spotlight.
The Prime Minister's accused of not taking the concerns of MP safety appropriately seriously. He called it humbug. Do you agree that it's humbug?
As I said, the Prime Minister can speak for himself.
Earlier today, Boris Johnson was strongly criticised by a former Conservative Prime Minister who accused him of whipping up dissent.
Words such as saboteur, traitor, enemy, surrender, betrayal, which should have no place in our party, no place in our political discourse, nor in our politics, and nor, for that matter, in our wider society.
In Downing Street, ministers met for a political cabinet meeting, a pep talk from the Prime Minister, perhaps in case anyone was doubting the strategy. No chances of getting a deal now are nil, aren't they?
Well, the Prime Minister's been very clear, is that he is very much determined in trying to get a deal, but I think the key issue is that we will be leaving on the 31st of October, preferably with a deal, if not, then without.
But a deal would need cross-party cooperation, and that seems to be vanishing.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
Casually dismissing concerns about threats and abuse has some Leave supporting Labour MPs questioning if they could ever back a Boris Johnson Brexit deal.
The thing that made me most angry last night was that this is clearly part of a deliberate strategy to be as divisive as possible, to try to stoke rage and hate outside of Parliament, to try to pit the people against Parliament.
But it's the divisions between Parliament and Prime Minister that seem higher than ever.
And Angus joins me from Westminster. Angus, it's a question we've returned to, but with the deal looking less and less likely, what do you think is the government's strategy henceforth?
Well, it feels like an election campaign strategy is being played out in the Commons. I spoke to a senior government advisor today who believes that this row will look like lots of MPs shouting at each other and not delivering Brexit, and they believe that that portrayal of MPs will help them when it comes to the actual election. And they also, to an extent today, senior Conservatives I've been speaking to have been trying to shape the row into one that they want to have by saying we could end all this hostility if you just backed a Brexit deal. And as for the Brexit deal itself, the Brexit Secretary, Stephen Barclay, will be in Brussels tomorrow to meet Michel Barnier, offering another document from the government. And of course, if there's no deal by mid-October, by the EU summit in mid-October, then the Prime Minister is meant to write to the European Union and ask for an extension. It's becoming clearer that they are finding loopholes in that law passed by MPs to block no deal. If they have a cunning plan, they're keeping it close to their chests.
Thank you very much, Angus in Westminster.
Tonight, the Prime Minister insisted that while he deplored threats to anybody, he was right to call opposition legislation the Surrender Act, while his advisor, Dominic Cummings, was reported to have said that he wasn't surprised that people are angry and described MPs as disconnected. The atmosphere in the House of Commons today was a little like a family meal after a hideous row the night before. The Speaker said the debate had been toxic, and one MP described the present mood there as a dystopian nightmare. While some called for civility and restraint, there was a sense also that others have found the strong words cathartic and empowering, with their own base at least. So the loaded language of surrender, betrayal, coups and fascists is still in use as Brexit reaches its crisis and MPs manoeuvre for advantage in the election they all expect. Our political editor, Nick Watt, was down in the bear pit.
A reminder of a gentler world. In the land of the nation's power brokers. Vintage scenes for a film.
It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister said this yesterday. He should apologise.
In the real world, raw anger in the House of Democracy after Boris Johnson yesterday dismissed as humbug concerns about the safety of MPs.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
And hostility in Parliament towards the Prime Minister's chief strategist.
That tone of language is going down well, Dominic. That tone of language the Prime Minister is using is going down well in constituencies like mine. I've had death threats overnight. Should be dead. It's a disgrace. Get Brexit. I've had 3 opportunities to get Brexit from Theresa May, and if I could have voted for it, I would have voted for it. Don't tell me to get Brexit done.
A Labour MP who challenged the Prime Minister in the corridors of Parliament is disappointed.
Boris Johnson will do whatever is best for Boris Johnson. It doesn't matter how many people are arrested trying to kick down the door at my office. It doesn't matter how many death threats I get. If it's going to work for Boris Johnson will carry on doing it. I wish that he chose to lead. Instead, he's chosen to divide.
The Prime Minister appreciates his language could cost him support.
But you're losing the possibility of Labour votes to get agreement in the House of Commons.
Well, I mean, I think that's a reasonable anxiety, and I need to reach out across the House of Commons to
you
get
need
people...
to watch your language more,
well,
don't you?
I think it's fair enough to call the Surrender Act what it is. I think it's absolutely reasonable. But you're also right, Peter, that we do need to bring people together and get this thing done.
A meeting of the political cabinet as Boris Johnson told aides he regretted using the word humbug, but he will continue to use strong language to criticise MPs who want to delay Brexit.
Ben Wallace, I'm very well.
I'm fine.
You're
How are you?
a mild-mannered one-nation Tory.
I am, definitely. We all are.
Have you been disappointed by the language used by your very good friend Boris Johnson?
I think everyone is passionately believing about something, and that's what
Passionately believing in something?
people passionately believe in the debate, and we've got to resolve it. That's why we've got to leave Europe.
But has he not alienated people?
Excuse me, do you believe Boris Johnson?
Now, you've known Boris Johnson a long time. What did you think of the language he used last night? Were you disappointed?
Parliament is a very unhappy place at the moment, but I think Boris stayed well within the margins of normal discussion in Parliament.
And is there a danger that using that sort of language could actually alienate sort of Labour MPs you need to get a deal through?
But I don't think Boris used intemperate language.
It's extremely harmonious cabinet, as always is.
But Parliament's not so harmonious.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is doing absolutely the right thing to try and get a deal, but we're determined that we will be leaving on the 31st of October, preferably with a deal, but if not, then without a deal.
A symbol of stability where the nation's differences are normally resolved. Impasse on Brexit, provocative language outside.
Well, Nick Waters here with the latest. An intervention this evening from a former Conservative Prime Minister.
That's right, Sir John Major. He's saying tonight that he fears that Boris Johnson is planning to embark on what he calls a piece of political chicanery. And he thinks that Boris Johnson is planning to come up with a way of suspending the Act of Parliament that is designed to ensure that Britain's membership of the EU is extended if no deal is reached by the 19th of October. And John Major is saying that Boris Johnson could do that through what is known as an order of council, which just involves Privy Councillors, rather than an order in council, which would involve the Queen. Now, it's certainly true in Downing Street they want to bypass this act, and in an ideal world, they would cheat this act.
What about the 27 other members of the EU? I mean, they must have been looking on over the last couple of days. What have they made of this?
Well, there's a fast diminishing confidence in the EU that we are going to reach a deal by that deadline of the 19th of October. And they've been watching what's happening here, watching these attempts to bypass the Act. And they've been coming up with their own ideas to ensure they can play their role, ensuring that the Act can come into force. So they believe that if the Act is triggered, the request letter for an extension will be sent either by the Prime Minister or by a senior civil servant who would be instructed by a court. They fear that Boris Johnson would then come to Brussels and sort of under duress saying, I'm only complying with the will of Parliament, that could sort of scupper the extension. So what they're planning is at the European Council on the 17th and 18th of October, 2 days before the deadline in the Act, at that summit, they would agree that they would accept the extension request when they get the letter, if they get the letter, subject to there being a general election in the UK, which of course Boris Johnson supports.
All right, thank you very much. Well, as Nick was just telling us, former Prime Minister John Major has been speaking out tonight. Among other things, he described the government's approach as profoundly unconservative and argued it will do permanent damage to the party's reputation. Well, joining us now are three people who were all once within that party, but have been flung into different places by the ongoing political earthquake. In Birmingham and still in the Tory fold is Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell. Here in the studio, the former Conservative MPs, Dominic Grieve and Anne Widdicombe, one expelled by Boris Johnson for opposing him, the other now a Brexit Party MEP. Welcome to you all. Andrew Mitchell, let's pick up those remarks by Sir John Major tonight, that the Prime Minister, who you support, has damaged the reputation of the Conservative Party with his appearances in the House of Commons.
Well, I haven't seen John Major's comments. This underlines the fact that we live in a country that is incredibly divided at the moment. These are divisions which are out of all proportion to anything I've seen in my 32 years in the House of Commons. And the answer, in my view, is to hopefully get a deal, but to move on and leave. We're mired in deep mud at the moment, and we have to make progress. And what I think everyone can accept is that Boris Johnson is trying to make that progress. He's made it clear he wants to get out by the 31st of October, preferably with a deal. And I think that is right, because until we do that, we're not going to be able to tackle these incredible divisions which disfigure our society and split families, parts of the country, and different constituencies.
Let's talk about what was said yesterday by the Prime Minister, for example, on the subject of the murdered MP Jo Cox. Now, you had a very good friendship with her, despite being on different sides of the House. I mean, your heart must have sunk when you heard him using that phrase about humbug, about female MPs and concerns about their safety in the context of Jo Cox's murder.
Well, I did feel uncomfortable about the Jo Cox's legacy being thrown across the chamber, but it has to be said that it wasn't the Prime Minister who started that. And I felt even more uncomfortable when I heard her husband speaking on the BBC this morning, who I also felt was very uncomfortable. And you think of the family and the children and so on. I think it's very important that members of Parliament on all sides are extremely careful about the language that they use, notwithstanding the fact that this is a tremendously turbulent and difficult time which evokes incredibly strong emotions from people on all sides of the House. And at the end of the day, Mark, you know, I think that I look across the chamber, I see these huge divisions that are taking place. But most members of the House of Commons, wherever they stand in this argument, are trying to get to the right place as they see it for their constituents.
I wonder just whether you feel, moving on from that to his other language, the Surrender Act, this type of thing, that he hasn't made it much harder to get a deal, if indeed he can reach one with the 27 EU countries, through the Houses of Parliament.
Well, I think that the Surrender Act, I think it's being slightly overdone. You know, we've had death taxes, we've had this flowery political language.
Well, I think he used the phrase 12 times, didn't he, in his remarks?
I'm not worried about that. I'm much more concerned about the way in which language is being used to attack, particularly women in the House of Commons, and debase the nature of our democracy. So I think that, you know, you have a debate about whether it's a Surrender Act or not, but I think that's within the bounds of normal political discussion.
But does it make it harder? That's the key question. Are there MPs, Lisa Nandy, other people who were speaking today, who are just going to find it harder to support a deal if indeed he's able to bring one back from the European Council?
Well, it may or it may not, but the critical thing is not that language, in my view. It is the nature of any deal he can bring back. And I'm far more optimistic than others that in the end, in the EU, my experience is that these deals are done at the last minute, and that if it's going to come together, it will be at the last minute that it does.
All right, Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much. Now in the studio, Anne Widdecombe, I mean, what do you think about the threats that are being faced by female MPs in this atmosphere?
First of all, going back to the atmosphere of yesterday in the Commons, I think the nation really is utterly fed up. That at this time, when the issue is the future of the country, its independence, what is going to be agreed, all those major issues that haven't been sorted out in 3 years, and there the MPs are talking about themselves and the language that is used and all the rest of it. I actually think the whole lot of them now need to grow up and to listen to their constituents who are saying to them, get it done.
Do you trust Boris Johnson to get it done?
I trust him to try. Whether he will succeed, Mystic Meg couldn't tell you, quite honestly.
Well, Nigel Farage, after the verdict from the Supreme Court, called for his resignation. I know a lot of Brexit Party members disagreed with that. Some were on the same page, but where are you on that? I mean, do you think Boris Johnson should have resigned? Because
as far as I'm concerned, Boris Johnson is trying. I do not know that he will be successful. I wouldn't put any money on the 31st of October at all. But as far as I'm concerned, he is trying to deliver what the nation voted for, which is Brexit. Now, that deal that he is talking about, to me, is not Brexit.
So you want him to stay in situ, then, while he tries?
Well, I think what we might get if he went is something much worse. I mean, you know, but for heaven's sake, this isn't about personalities. This is about Brexit. This is about delivering what the British people asked for.
But
3 long years.
But he's going to argue
discussions.
that he's the only person actually in a position to do so.
Well, let him get on and do it then, and we'll all cheer if he does. If he delivers a proper Brexit, that is, and not the surrender.
I wonder
act.
whether you might be tiptoeing back towards a Conservative whip.
I am not tiptoeing in any direction at all. I am firmly planted in the Brexit Party because it is the only party that is promising to deliver Brexit in line with what the British people asked for.
Dominic Grieve, let's just come back briefly to that speech by Sir John Major this evening. One of the things he was putting forward was he believed he had got information, as Nick was explaining earlier, that there might be an attempt to sidestep the Benn Act. And it's been reported today that people like yourself who helped to draft it had been considering this and how to prevent him doing it. What's the truth of that? Is that a real option, and what can you do to stop it?
I didn't entirely follow what John Major was looking at. I think he may well have been referring to the Civil Contingencies Act, which allows primary legislation to be suspended by order in an emergency. You certainly can't suspend this legislation. You have to show that the suspension is relevant to the emergency. It plainly wouldn't be. It would help bring it to an end in some way by suspending it. Actually, this legislation would bring the emergency to an end if it extends Article 50. All I can say is I'm confident that any attempt by the government to circumvent the Benn Act is going to fail. And I begin to think that one of the interesting shifts that we now have in our national politics is that number 10 used to be a source of information. It's now a source of fake news and disinformation, which is pumped out for propaganda purposes.
What is all this speculation from John Major, if not disinformation?
No, John has picked up that the origin of this story came from number 10. I'm quite confident about that.
Well, they've been briefing out.
They've been briefing it out. And I've begun to conclude that rather than briefing out fact, number 10 now briefs out fiction, because either they want to spread despondency amongst their opponents, or possibly they want to influence the negotiations with the EU. It's not clear to me which it is, but whichever it is, I'm confident that an attempt to stop the Benn Act working, if the preconditions kick in and he's required to write this letter, it will fail.
And the supposition that there is something new about spin coming out from number 10 is unbelievable, Dominic, and you don't believe that. Come on, you're a lawyer. You don't believe that.
And there's a difference in nature and quality. Of course, there's been spin. But one of the things that really has made me aghast by the present Prime Minister is the sheer capacity for the recital of untruth.
We haven't got much time left, I'm sorry to say, but can I just ask you, before we wrap up, about this idea that the events in the Commons over the past few days will have alienated people who might have voted for a deal. Now, I know that's not your stance, but you talk to colleagues who might be considering voting or not voting for a deal, if indeed it's possible at this hour to do one. Do you think in that sense he has given up on a deal?
I think he may have done, because he certainly has alienated some of the people who he wanted to bring on side. If he wants to get a deal through, depending on what it has to be a deal which has support of a substantial number of Labour MPs. And Labour MPs yesterday were aghast, including many on whom I think he was likely to want to rely.
All right, Dominic Grieve, Anne Widdecombe and Andrew Mitchell, thank you all very much. Now, look, so many of the questions about how the Prime Minister might navigate the law in any possible deal with the EU, try to keep to his no-deal option, or indeed in his battle of wills with Parliament, revolve around the law. Who better to step through some of those legal questions than a former Downing Street counsel, Andrew Hood, who worked for David Cameron in the past as PM and is now with the law firm Field Fisher. Welcome, Andrew. I mean, when you hear the Prime Minister basically saying, I'm going to leave on October the 31st, despite what you know about the Benn Act and the Supreme Court ruling, I mean, what does he mean? What would your advice be to him if you were still in Downing Street about how he might achieve that?
Well, with great difficulty. I think the first point, of course, is that if he did nothing, the law currently says that we would leave on the 31st of October. Of course, what the Supreme Court decision means is that Parliament is now returned, which will make his life a lot more difficult in doing so. We hear about the ideas of orders in council, orders of council, and I'm sure there'll be advisors looking at all the options that might be there. What you also do as advisors is, certainly as a legal advisor, is to say what your chances of success would be. And I think in this case, it seems to me, very much as Dominic Grieve was saying, that the chances of success in trying to find a way around the Benn Act would be very difficult.
You don't see a loophole?
I think I don't see a loophole now, no, not at the moment, but these are extraordinary times. The other thing I would say, just on a sort of technical point when one is looking at the law, is that if we want to have an orderly Brexit, even in the case of a no deal on the 31st of October, there's a whole raft of legislation that still has to be passed, whether it's acts relating to trade, immigration, agriculture, fisheries, all the subsets of laws underneath that, none of which are in place yet. And if the idea is to leave on the 31st of October, one of the key bits of advice to the Prime Minister would be you would need to get those through. If you get those through Parliament, then that's the opportunity for more mischief from Parliament.
Would you say that even if, against all expectation now, something remarkable happens in the negotiations over the next 10 days, say, that he will need a so-called technical extension to get that agreement through Parliament in the ways you've been describing, that even if he succeeds in getting a deal, the Prime Minister would have to go beyond the 31st of October?
Well, it depends when he would get that deal. As far as I can see, we're quite far from that. There's a lot to be done, and even if you got the deal, you'd have to navigate the politics of Parliament. And it seems to me, you know, I'm a lawyer, not a politician, but the events of the last 24 hours make that very difficult.
And if he sticks to his position that he is not going to request an extension, this is what he's said, I mean, how much legal jeopardy is he in? I mean, what would your advice be to a Prime Minister who took that line publicly?
I'd probably follow the advice of Lord Sumption, who was a Supreme Court Justice until recently, who said, if you don't ask for an extension, as the Benn Act requires, then you'll be before the courts very quickly, and I would think in very short order there would be an order from the courts for that request to be submitted to the EU. Now, whether that's done by the Prime Minister or by the Cabinet Secretary or by some other person named by the courts, the request would go in, I think.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed.